And nice to have everybody here. We'll bring that back up, and let me just bring this to the beginning. Cool. Also use chat to field some questions. I'll try to take my pauses in between, and you can unmute yourself at any time if you don't see me getting around to it. Actually, 1 second. Pardon. I just want to make sure that. Okay, cool. Got all my I's dotted and T's crossed as we get started. Greetings from Sonoma. I forget where this is taken from. I think I got it off of VinePair, the actual picture itself, but they always have the Napa Valley, welcome to Napa Valley sign. It almost looked like this is at like a custom crush facility or some, not even that, but they call it like urban wine bars where they make the wines in the city, but maybe sourced from outside vineyards, and you can go and use it like a tasting room. But here we'll go over the history, the geography, climate. Big thing here is it can range quite a bit from the coast to further inland. Determining style, a little brush on wine laws, but really I want us to be able to go from the different areas, the wine appellations, and start to understand the differences based on these locations, and maybe a little bit something about the history and some of the producers that help form these regions. But it's a little bit different in Sonoma, mostly with California. We talk about these missionaries that were the first to bring grapes over to the West Coast, first coming in through Mexico, these Spanish missionaries in like the 1500s, and had previously went down south, going into areas of like Chile and then eventually Argentina. And with them, establishing his missions and planting one grape. I'm sure a few of you know what it is the mission grape. Oh, forgive me. 1 more second, you guys. I just got to bring up my chat box. I lost it when we went back to my share. Does anybody know the one mission, or I already said it, the one grape that they all planted during this time? It's also the mission grape, which you'll now hear as like Peay or like Criolla Chica in Argentina, but originally coming from the Canary Islands and southern parts of Spain. But they pretty much just brought this one grape. Besides heading down to South America, eventually they came up through New Mexico, and then through Southern California. And the furthest place that they made it, the furthest point, after establishing 21 of them, these missions, they stopped here in San Francisco de Solano. And you can see this in the town of Sonoma. I think there's still a site there where you can see this original mission if you're over there visiting. So usually talk about these Spanish missionaries and how they're establishing the California wine scene in the 17 and 1800s, the San Francisco de Solano being the very last of it in their northernmost output. But there was a point before that where Sonoma had a head start on the rest of the state. And this is thanks to our Russian fur traders that came down from Alaska and established themselves on Fort Ross Seaview, right along the coast as sea otter. They would trade the different furs, and then actually made their way further inland too, but went back up. It wasn't very successful for them, went back up to Alaska. And we have to talk a little bit about Napa when we're talking about Sonoma. There's a shared influence there. George Yount, he was the one to arrive in Napa and plant the very first vineyards, and that was in 1839. So if it wasn't these missions, when other people are starting to plant. Before we can get into our friend Augustine Harristy, what we really have is, yeah, Pax makes a mission grape. If you look at chat, you guys, I don't want to just make your ears hurt me saying mission over and over again, but it's one of these few grapes that was kind of lost over the years, even with its original plantings, that people are finding these abandoned vineyards or maybe forgotten vineyards, or vineyards that were previously growing grapes for other purposes, if it was bulk production. But now you see these winemakers and working with some of these growers and are releasing these unique historic varietals. And they can almost drink like a light Pinot or a deep rosé. So you can find these mission grapes being bottled and released, and you can drink them. Pax is one of the producers in chat that Liz mentions. Really fun stuff. But before we see all this influx of people, we had the gold rush. And you think of 1849, I always think of San Francisco 49ers, but this is where everybody went to hopefully strike gold and or find gold and strike it rich in the Sierra foothills. But then again, that didn't last too long. So once that fizzled out, this is when we start to see people heading over to the Napa and Sonoma area near San Francisco by the water. And then here comes our friend Augustin Harris-Thie, who founds Buena Vista Winery in 1857, and it's still established today. But what he's given a lot of credit for is that he was commissioned to go over to Europe and then bring back all these different vine cuttings. So this is when we start to see, besides just German and Italian and French immigrants, perhaps bringing cuttings of their own, Augustin was really the one responsible for bringing these other grapes, where we might start seeing things like Zinfandel. They thought he was originally one to bring it, but they've proven that to not be the true. But other grapes like Petit Syrah and Carignan and Alicante Bouschet, just these other European varietals, when did they make their way? 1857. And then kind of an overlap here again. You know, we have Buena Vista now established. George Yount had already planted close to 20, 30 years ago. Charles Krug in the 60s and 70s, first commercial winery in Napa, Charles Krug. Schramsberg do wonderful sparkling wines that are still around today. Beringer also did a lot within Napa, especially like Knights Valley, I think of right away. And then Inglenook with like Gustav Niebaum. So we saw this rise and growth and this early success in the late 1800s. And then we have the phylloxera, the terrible root louse that devastated the world's vineyards, had previously existed on American rootstock, but when they brought this European cuttings, this Vinifera spinifera, they weren't adapted to this phylloxera, so most vineyards were destroyed. So even though we saw this early success in the late 1800s, they had this first of many hiccups where they had to start to replant their vines. And as they were starting to reestablish themselves, we move into the Prohibition, which lasted about 13 years, 1920 to 1933. And after Prohibition, people got used to drinking cocktails and eventually moved to a preferred style of just like sweet fortified jug wine. And you can see then from this point, from the 1930s all the way to like the 60s, even 70s, is fortified jug wine, just like those sherries or ports, that accounted for 80% of all California production, quite a lot. And again, just it was the preferred style for people all throughout the country. They just weren't drinking a lot of wine at this time. In 1966, Robert Mondavi, we're over in Napa still, but this is where he splits off from his family's winery that they purchased, Charles Krug. He went off, got in a fight with his brother, and created his own synonymous winery, and really just drove this direction towards quality and brought international attention to Napa. One of the major figures, if it's not Robert Mondavi, it's this Judgment of Paris here too. And you guys, who got first place for their Chardonnay in 1976? Even though these were based off of Napa wines mostly, that's right, Chateau Montelena. Jeff wanted to write Chateau Montelena, or CHXM, which is fun, is because Chateau Montelena, the winner of our Judgment of Paris, is based in northern parts of Napa. 80% of the fruit that they used that got them first place was from Sonoma County, some of it being Alexander. So a little side nod to Sonoma and that success. And then we start to see this rise in quality. Diamond Creek, this is a fun kind of, could be a trivia thing if anything else, but Cabernets can go for a lot these days. Diamond Creek in 1978 was the first to exceed $100,000 on release. Appellations are starting to become established in the early 80s. Napa was one of them. Augustus, Missouri was actually right before this. Anyway, side note. And with the rising prestige of Napa, phylloxera returns. They have to replant. I'm going to move past this. We also have the Robert Parker. So we have the introduction of points. But let's bring it back to Sonoma. And I love this. If you want to know the very first Pinot Noir to retail over $100, it was the William Salem Suma Vineyard, which is kind of fun just to be aware of. And then now we're just with the 2010s for me, just to kind of keep going on. Exciting times, moving into cooler climates that they thought previously wouldn't even be able to ripen grapes successfully. So it's new territory for them to explore and open up maybe opportunities to play around with different varietals. And then in 2013, Jean Bonnet, previous writer for San Francisco Chronicle, he writes the New California Wine. So you can see about some of these producers and these winemakers, especially in like the early 2010s, that were doing amazing things. What is Augustin Hairston known for? He's the guy that brought over all these cuttings, right? Started Buena Vista Winery, but started introducing some of these more familiar grapes that we have today. Did you already? Usually people get down to the bottom point before I even get in there. But besides, it's just got a lot of storytelling, like where he established a winery in Wisconsin, operated the first commercial steamboat along the Mississippi. He was a sheriff in San Diego, and then was eating alligators in Nicaragua. But he brought grapes and he brought Buena Vista. He established that. And then this is the guy that I'm glad he's getting a lot more attention these days. I just feel like it was never a name that we came across. And I think from maybe just its intimidation of spelling, but Andrei Chelichev, he was hired by George Latour over in Blue Vineyards in Napa. As they reopened from prohibition, they had to work on just the cleanliness and the winemaking and to understand that a little bit better. So they picked up Andrei Chelichev, this George Latour, when he was over in Europe, and he was a Russian enologist that kind of understood a little bit better the functions of like macrobiology and cleanliness, where they could then now just ship wines throughout the country and have them sent without spoiling, and the wines could just drink clean. And that was like a new bar and level of quality too. Besides this famous top cuvee, you could say, is this George de Latour Reserve that was released right after George Latour's death in 1938. But why he's also super important. I mean, he mentored quite a few people in not only Napa but of Sonoma too, where it was Robert Mondavi, Joseph Heights of Heights Cellars, Gergich, all these people, Joseph Swan of Russian River Valley. I was going to say Joel Peterson of Ravenswood. All of them were kind of who they would learn from, and who served as a mentor for all of these guys was Andrei Chelichev. When people were moving down to areas of Carneros in the 60s and 70s, again, people were moving away from fortified wine, starting to plant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in Sonoma and even Russian River Valley. Oftentimes this was under the guidance and the advice of Andrei Chelichev. He's a 5 foot tall Russian guy who had 2 cigarettes in his hand at all times of day, but he knew his winemaking. So you hear wonderful stories about him. This is just a little bit of our wine law system that was established in late 70s, early 80s. Tax and Trade Bureau overseen today. Pretty loose, and that's what's kind of fun about it. Really, just if we see Pinot Noir on the label, 75% of it must be coming from Russian River Valley. But this is a single vineyard, so it's a little bit higher required percentage. If you actually see a single vineyard, it has to be 95% of that stated grape, if I remember correctly. But yeah, 2006, 95% must be from the vintage. And if it comes from, if it comes from the AVA, I got ahead of myself. Russian River Valley. 85% of it must come from that region.
The Russian River Valley in California.
Yeah, and Sonoma. But and it can work like a target. Essentially, if we're in the North Coast, which oversees like Sonoma and Mendocino and Lake and Napa, Marine and Solano. So, but we're in the North Coast, and then we're in Sonoma County. And this is actually a good thing with wine labeling, because within Sonoma County, we have Sonoma Valley. Within Sonoma Valley, we have Sonoma Mountain. Within Sonoma Mountain, we have a single vineyard designations that we can see. And that'll make more sense when I bring up a map. There's still just a lot of room for flexibility, which is winemaking. It's pretty loosey-goosey. I like this. I just looked up this recently just to kind of look at plantings where we can see Chardonnay is the most planted in all of Sonoma, Pinot Noir right behind that, Cabernet, and then moving into Zinfandel, Merlot, Syrah. So more than 60 different grapes, but 7 grapes make up about 90% of plantings, but you can get into this unique finds. If it's not even like the mission grape, you can find things like Vermentino, Sagrantino, like from Umbria, Trousseau Gris, Jolie Lade, part of the Pax group, playing around with that. But to see most of it made by these few more recognizable, but playing around with some unique finds too. Because when they were planning like post-phylloxera and moving into prohibition, they just wanted wines that, or grapes that were very vigorous and were easy to grow, and you could use them as like altar wines that you could ship across country. So a lot of like heavy plantings during the early 20th century were like not only Zinfandel, but like Alicante Boucher, Petit Syrah, Carignan, that when people started moving towards, we could say, higher quality, if it wouldn't be Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, they'd be ripping up these other vines, Alicante Boucher, Carignan, Petit Syrah. But you can find some of those remaining grapes, those grapes remaining in scattered vineyards that now people are kind of paying a little more attention to. Just kind of piggybacking on that idea of their other unique varietals, where are they coming from and why were they being planted? Like Barbera, a lot of this, like Sagrantino, some of these came over from the times of Italian immigrants too that were managed to stay planted. So Sonoma County, that's everything here. That's everything. So if you see nothing but Sonoma County on your wine label, it's like the grapes could be coming here from Sonoma Coast, which is still rather large. This is all this tan beige area. Yeah, and then here, like this is Russian River Valley, right below. Like, so it could be, because I heard you mention like, oh, Russian River Valley is this big green area here too. I am very thankful for wine where it helps me learn about geography, where I have to look at wine maps quite often. Like I even lived in California for a number of years, and I always had to remind myself that Napa and Sonoma are actually above San Francisco, right down below. And I feel like, oh my gosh, that must be so apparent to everybody else. But like even living in the state, I would have to remind myself that. But here we're just right up north of San Francisco, not too far, a 30-mile drive, and you could just take the Highway 101 to get up into this region. And with geography, we have Pacific Ocean here in the west, bringing these cool ocean breezes. And as we move further inland, less influenced by the cool ocean winds and the fog that can make its way over these vineyard sites, allowing for other cooling influences. Well, that can start to burn off once we get into like Dry Creek and Alexander Valley, where it's getting to be a little bit warmer, moving north. And then we get into the mountain ranges, the Mayacamas, which divides Sonoma from Napa. Now we have Mendocino to the north, some fun things coming up from there. A lot of redwood trees up here. It's kind of a little more scattered. And then if we're down south, you can see the San Pablo Bay, but again, cooler areas just by its proximity to the water. And it's a much larger area. Like if we blew up Napa over here, it's this little thin like stretch of land and vineyards. Like where the overall growing conditions might be a little more consistent. It's the same idea that you get these cooling influences further south, like Los Carneros or San Pablo Bay. You can see that it stretches over into Napa. It's the one shared AVA between Napa and Sonoma. So this is one of the cooler areas. I repeat this quite a lot, but I just like the picture that comes to head. Like Karen McNeil, the wine Bible, she would write, you know, in the middle of summer, same day, middle of the afternoon. If you're in Carneros, you might be wearing a wind jacket or a windbreaker just because it's a little bit cooler. But like if you're in Napa and you moved further inland, less influenced by the cool coast, like here you'd be hanging out by the pool on a hot summer day in your swim trunks. Same time, same day. Down here, you're wearing a windbreaker. So we kind of see that same idea as we move inland over here. And they say this area, Sonoma Valley. So you can see this then, right? Sonoma County, everything. And then here's Sonoma Valley. So if I see that on a wine label, I know that the fruit is coming from a much more specific area. But it's kind of this like rectangle shape, similar to like the larger Napa. So sometimes they compare Sonoma Valley just north, south to north, moving inland, mimicking the general climate conditions and growing conditions you'd see in Napa. Cool, and then warmer once we get into like Bennett Valley and Sonoma Mountain. 45,000 acres planted in Napa, 60,000 over here in Sonoma. So just more vine underground. And then if it's, again, just elevation that influences temperature just by body water, and then soil types a little bit. You see a little more volcanic as we move into the mountain areas. You see this mix of like volcanic and marine deposits. They call it Franciscan soils that can categorize a lot of these areas. But yeah, you're right along these two tectonic plates, like the northern plate and the Pacific plate, where some of these areas were underwater. So there's this marine deposits that can characterize a lot of these vineyards, as it was all once underground, and then you can, or underwater. You can see that further south too. Dominated by Sonoma coast. Yep. Yeah, and this is just a little comment of just again within Sonoma County, how much of this is Sonoma coast. I'll say it right here, why not? So what this Andy and Nick Peay and a lot of these producers based on along the coasts, they're trying to come up with this a new AVA, American Viticulture Area, which is just West Sonoma or West Coast. They say true Sonoma coast, which would be like right along here, this little stretch. It's not on the map yet. It hasn't been yet granted official status yet, but it's in the works, because the reason for it is that if you have grapes grown like right here along the coast, it's going to be much more influenced by the fog or perhaps elevation or just by being by the ocean in general. And if you move way over here, you're still within the Sonoma coast. This is much, much warmer, where you're getting a lot more sun. You might want to plant Cabernet over here, where here Cabernet would never successfully ripen. You need a grape that prefers a cooler growing season, like Pinot Noir Chardonnay, right? And if Pinot Noir Chardonnay over here, it just, you wouldn't maybe producing the type of fruit that you'd like. It would maybe ripen just too quickly in that hot, intense sun. And then this is, they label by conjunction. I think the intent was to just, you might not know like Green Valley of Russian River Valley or Chalk Hill or Fountain Grove. So since 2011, they'll say like Fountain Grove, Sonoma County. So you still know that it's coming from Sonoma. So just a little side note there with wine labeling, and then some of our major varietals. But when they were coming up with our AVAs, the first one that was recognized was Sonoma Valley in 1981. Carneros was recognized in 1981, but again, this is a shared appellation between Napa and Sonoma. Going back to the 1850s, as far as when it was first planted, again, where are we? We're in the southeastern part. And then here, our black dot, we'd see that we'd be in the town of Sonoma, where the San Francisco de Solano, the last mission, was established, right? So you'd probably be staying in here, and then you might be able to just like cruise up to some of these wineries and visit too. I was scrolling through our thread on this Guildsom site where it's a small AA site where someone was going to Sonoma to visit, and like, well, what do you guys do? Do you rent a car or do you just depend on Uber? Or I would be like, I just want to depend on Uber. But supposedly when you get into areas like up here, you don't have the Ubers or the taxis like we see in New York. So they've had issues where sometimes guests were stranded at the wineries because they had no luck getting an Uber. So maybe you rent a car. And when I was bringing up the Mayacamas Mountains, I've only been to like Napa and Sonoma once or twice. And I would like to spend some more time there visiting wineries, but I know it can be very heavily traffic. There can be a lot of heavy traffic over here in the middle of summer, or used to be. And there's only like one or two ways where you can actually cross over the Mayacamas. So I thought it would be easier to get back and forth, but there's only a couple ways for you to get to and from if you're going back and forth. Do the AVAs get warmer as you move north in Sonoma? Like, yeah. Yes, northeast. Oh, another here thing too, Liz. UC Davis, where a lot of people go to enology school, and where it serves as like a reference. There's a lot of published material that winemakers can use to help them in their vineyards and even in their winemaking. One of the things they came up with this is this like Winkler climate scale or index scale, where they give regions 1 through 5 as far as cooler to warmer. That could help give you an idea of what grape varietals could grow well. Well, over here in Sonoma Coast is region 1, the coolest. When we get into Russian River Valley, it might be like region 2. And then when we get over here, it might be like region 3. Most of Napa is like region 3, if you want to look at it that way. So another example maybe of the difference in temperatures as we move from the coast inland. But within our Sonoma Valley A, we have 4 sub-AVAs, Carneros, right? Sonoma Mountain, just right north. One of the higher elevation sites within Sonoma Valley. These were actually taken from some of the Sonoma, it's taken from the Sonoma site. And there's great, that could be a great resource if you're visiting there too, as far as like if we're breaking down acres or wineries that are actually located within these AVAs, to perhaps look at it this way. It's kind of funny. You would almost think that there were more wineries actually headquartered there, but not too many. But a great place for Cabernet, higher elevation, one of the warmer sites. If we move northwest of Sonoma Mountain, still within her valley, it's a little bit cooler. They actually start to see this influence of this Petaluma Gap. This is a newer AVA that was recognized in 2017, as these areas are applied for and granted. But there's a break in the coastal mountains. So this actually hot air from the Central Valley, it acts like a vacuum sucking in the cool air from the coast through this little gap in the mountain ranges. And then it funnels out over into the San Pablo Bay. So you kind of get this cool gust of winds that heads through the gap and then empties out over San Pablo Bay. While some of the areas over here can experience a little of that cool wind because of this gap. Bennett Valley, although it's further inland and warmer, great for like our heavier reds. But for that slight influence of the Petaluma Gap, it's a little bit cooler than Sonoma Mountain. So although you can go Cabernet really well here, here we do a little bit better for Merlot that doesn't require the sun that Cabernet does. So Bennett Valley is really known for Merlot. That's a strong takeaway for today. And then Moon Mountain, Valley of the Moon, just where it got its name from a local tribe that used to reside in this area, Valley of the Moon. This is where we have a lot of our old vine Zinfandel vineyards. Monte Rosso, I think of as one of them. That Ravenswood used to work with, but a lot of these old vine vineyards, if it's not further inland over here, for Zinfandel, are located here in Moon Mountain. I might come back to that. And then some of our famous producers that play around with these vineyards, if it's not Ravenswood, Martini, to not only Moon Mountain, but Carneros, and then Benziger. I think that was meant to be Behringer. Oh, another good ones. And I just wanted to go through my notes real quick to make sure there wasn't other things that I was forgetting. Goonlock, Boonlish, or Goonlock was one of the founding wineries in Sonoma Valley in the 1800s, but we had a Chardonnay sitting on our shelves from them the other day, Gundlach. And when people, before Joseph Swan or Joe Rocchioli started playing around with Pinot Noir here in like the 70s, before they even made its way over to the coast, more like the late 80s, 90s, Hansel Winery in the Sonoma Valley area, Hansel, Hanzell, they were the ones to really focus on top quality Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So here, Chardonnay is one of the most planted grapes. Hansel Winery down in Sonoma were some of the first to really focus on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in the 50s is when they got their start. Is their Ambassador's Block. It's the oldest continuously produced Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in all of North America. Hansel's Ambassador Block. That was one thing I was looking for in my notes. But here's Carneros. Okay. This is actually established in 1981. Others were shortly to follow in 1983. But it means rams. Maybe it was 83. Maybe I got ahead of myself there. I just thought it was a little bit earlier. Because before like Hansel and Martini and people were going and planting like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in the southern regions, there's a big, there's a lot of sheep farming going on in the area, where hence it gets its name Carneros, which means rams or sheep. But southern AVA, so why it's influenced by the San Pablo Bay, about its link between Napa and Sonoma. And then interesting, where it's one of the first regions based off of climate rather than political boundaries, knowing that it's a cooler region, why grapes that will make wines that drink in a lighter style could go west. Goonie Booney, Goonlock Boonshoe. Thank you. Yeah, it's like I always say Goonlock and then Boonshoe, the name of the winery. That's great. Goonie Booney. But they were the first to plant in Sonoma Valley in the late 1800s. Anyway, 6,500 vineyard acres, 22 wineries. This is a good one to know. So Chardonnay and Pinot Noir do well down here, but it's not quite as cold as some of these new western coastal areas, like Fort Ross Seaview. It's a little bit warmer than that. But Chardonnay and Pinot Noir is two of the main grapes that usually go into sparkling wines, grapes that like cooler climates, producing wines that drink light and fresh. Similar to what you'd see in Champagne, where these sparkling wine houses, Champagne House, Taittinger, started Domaine Carneros in the 1980s, and then even Fresnet's Gloria Ferrer got their starts too. This international investment that started to kind of trickle over even after like Mondavi and the success of the Judgment of Paris. And other famous vineyards that we'll see in Carneros, San Giacomo, Hyde, and Hudson, those being on the Napa side, but having some influence too. Okay. As a warmer area, they might, in the right regions, they might do have some success with Merlot too, if you're a little bit further inland. So this is our big AVA, right? Sonoma Coast, our large umbrella appellation. Going from northern Mendocino all the way down to San Pablo Bay. If we're just looking north to south, looking at slightly cooler areas further north, and then just influenced by fog, elevation, and cool air. Kind of like, again, overlapping the same concept and ideas. Those areas, marine fog line. And then what we hope to see is, or what we'll see soon, is this establishment of this West Sonoma Coast AVA. And then just look at numbers here, 7 wineries, crazy. So a lot of people are actually just maybe sourcing from growers that have vineyards planted out in this region. And maybe just the fact that it isn't quite as established as some of the further inland areas. But the 2 main grapes, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and some of the producers. So David Hirsch was one of the first to go out there. He planted in 1978, and then you would start to see other producers start to source their fruit from his vineyards that he would grow out there. William Salem is one of the famous ones to source from out there. Literai would source from out there. Some names that you might recognize. Literai, he was one of the first to, it's a guy, Literai is a good one to mention right now. He's based in Sebastopol, which is like southern Russian River Valley. Does anybody know the winemakers? Oh, I just said it. Ted Lemon. But he was the first American to be hired to make wine over in Burgundy, France. So he gained a name for himself that way. And that was in the 80s. And if you love Burgundy and their whites, does anybody know what winery hired him? I'm not trying to quiz you. Rouleau. Rouleau had worked for him. So one of the great Marceau producers of Burgundy that can go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a list, if you can even get it. Ted Lemon had gained his experience working with Rouleau. He also worked with Caldera, if you're a Pinot fan, or Calera. I might hear Josh Calera down in like Central Coast, California. So he'd worked with him for a number of years too. He focuses on Pinot Noir from limestone soils. Anyway, Ted Lemon of Literai, first American to make wines in Burgundy, and then this is his own estate that he got started in the early 90s. One of the areas that he'd source fruit from was Hirsch. And then within the Sonoma Coast, we have one AVA, the first one that was wholly within the Sonoma Coast, and this is the Fort Ross Seaview, right? Was the first area for all Sonoma vineyard plantings, thanks to our Russian fur traders. First plantings 1817. Now we see it as an appellation in 2012. 5 wineries, 550 acres, all above the fog line. This is what we're talking about. And why do we need that? Is because if we're below that fog line, we'd be trapped in that cool area. So we need to be above 920 feet so we can get that extra sun. That's where it's all located. But then Russian River Valley. So still a good say part of the Sonoma Coast, but moving further inland, we're now at a region 2. This can be one of the warmest, it might be the warmest area for growing Pinot Noir in the entire world. So if you like a wine that's got a little extra ripeness of fruit, a little bit more pronounced, a little bit fuller for Pinot, you're not going to find a better example than Russian River Valley. They can get up to be like 14.5 alcohol, which can almost be like a baby Zinfandel sometimes. They're really ripe and rich in expression. It can vary a lot if you're just in Green Valley of Russian River Valley, again, about 12 miles from the coast, more influenced by the fog, versus still within Russian River Valley, but a sub-AVA. You can see we're pretty close to the Mayacamas over here in Chalk Hill. It's actually white volcanic soils, not chalk, but it looks like chalk. I characterize these vineyards. Here, warmer, white volcanic, looks like chalk, the soils. We're doing Cabernet up over here because it's just much, much warmer. But what identified or determined part of the Russian River Valley AVA, we do have the Russian River that goes through it. It kind of makes its way through a few of these AVAs. So based around this Russian River, that also helps bring in this fog that kind of can spread over this region that influences the AVA. So why they can be considered parts of that. Although it expanded a couple times, once in 2005 and once in 2011, really was Gallo that had vineyards right outside the previous boundaries, but they wanted to label it as Russian River Valley. So they petitioned to have the boundaries expanded to include some of their outlying vineyards. So they could now label some of their wines as just Russian River Valley when previously it could not. So you could see how those things could kind of rub people the wrong way. We're like, well, that's not, I don't know if that should actually be reason enough for this to distinguish place. You know what I'm saying, with these appellation expansions with their boundaries. The other thing, if it's not just the influence of flawed, with the help of not only our Petaluma Gap, but our Russian River, is that we have these gold ridge soils. It's a soft, yellow, sandy loam. Like it feels like silk, I guess, if you ever to pick it up and run it through your fingers. But it's a left that was all derived from marine deposits, underwater soil deposits that make up also the Russian River Valley. You know what? So you can see that gold ridge soil over here, which is great as a well-drained soil. Allows those roots to dig deep and search for nutrients. I think of one of Laura's favorite wineries is Iron Horse. They do some great sparkling wines from Green Valley. They were one of the first to move into this region in the 1970s, Iron Horse. So they do some great stuff. Yeah, and then I think of Joseph Swan coming in here in the Russian River Valley. Oh, actually, I'm going to bring this up here in a second. So even as a larger area, I just came across this afternoon, and I had really never heard about this. So this is just subregions with even in Russian River Valley that maybe might turn into eventual AVAs, but like Middle Reach to the north, near like Dry Creek, one of the warmer areas, Santa Rosa here. Down south, we see a little bit more Zinfandel plantings. As we get towards Santa Rosa, Laguna Ridge in the center. This is what was first planted to Pinot Noir by Joseph Swan. Amazing stuff. As we get down to the south, Sebastopol, I mean, again, it's just location. This is one of the cooler areas. Green Valley already recognized as its own AVA to the west. Gold Ridge soils, right? But Williams-Salem, a lot of major producers. Rocchioli, one of the major vineyard sites where people started sourcing Pinot Noir from. I heard this crazy story of Joe Rocchioli, kind of in preparation for this class too, where he found this cutting, but he was so foreign to him. It doesn't even make sense. So I don't know if there's any validity to this story, but he went down to UC Davis, but he had to write down the name of the grape because it was so foreign to him before he actually started planting Pinot Noir. He actually had to write down Pinot Noir so that he went down to get these clones. He could remember what it was. I don't know if that's true, but the difference in change in times of these plantings. But Rocchioli, one of the famous vineyard sites where like Dutton Goldfield would source from, and others. Williams-Salem is another one of the big ones. Again, Williams-Salem, one of the first wines to get $100 for their Pinot Noirs from Sumu Vineyard, which is more on the coast. Dry Creek Valley. So we're just heading right above the Russian River Valley, right? Should I bring up a map? We're just now heading into our Regions 3, our north center. Dry Creek, we'll head over to Alexander and then Knights Valley. So warmer, better for doing these old Zinfandel vines that have been dry farmed, and look how gnarly and cool they are. Like they're bush trained, they're not like trellis, they're not like hung up on wires or anything the way that they're grown. So you have to hand pick all this fruit too, and you're not getting as much fruit per vine as it continues to age, but you're usually getting higher quality, and they're more consistent with how the grapes grow. So we talked about that Region 3. Here we have 63 wineries. You know, I had these ladies come in and give us a little class on Dry Creek Valley once, but if it's cool. They had a topography map where everything over here on the western part of the river was all mountainous. So all those wineries that we just labeled, they would all located here on the eastern parts. It's just too hilly over here. Like Rockpile, there are no wineries located up here. Just a few people sourcing like Zinfandel and maybe Cabernet from Rockpile. But you have the town of Heldsburg. So if you're not staying in Sonoma, you might spend an afternoon up in Heldsburg and then tour some of your wineries up over in that area. Probably like Raffinelli's getting up in that region, Ridge, all these places. But Ridge known for Montebello and Santa Cruz and their Cabernet, and then they eventually went off and established themselves in the Dry Creek Valley area, but play around with both Alexander and Dry Creek. Some of this wines, a little departure from a lot of the French oak that's used in most regions of the world. Here they'll actually play around with some American oak. Some of these guys, even like Ravenswood and all these guys, even up into the 80s, I mean, people like Mondavi bought French oak over. It's a move towards making finer quality wines. But prior to that, and some people are actually playing around with this old practice, they were using redwood oak or redwood trees, redwood. These large barrels, and it would give them this kind of tannic, rustic edge to them. But some people are still playing around with them. Fail is great stuff too. Aaron Jordan. If you want some great, I'm looking in chat real quick. If you want some great Syrahs, Fela makes some awesome stuff besides the Chardonnay. Aaron Jordan, he was just inspired by, he gained a lot of experience while working in Rhone. Great podcast with him, Aaron Jordan. Anyway, he does a little side note. If you like Zin, it's a little more strange style. I'm looking under Liz's chat. This Fela, he has a new winery. It's called Day, just D-A-Y, but he does some Zinfandel from them too. Okay, Ridge, Raffinelli. Raffinelli is great. They only make like 3 wines. A Cabernet. Yeah, that's right. It's Day. That's right. They only make like 3 wines. A Zinfandel, a Cabernet, and I think the other one is Merlot. That's it. And it's usually just through mail order only. They are distributed here on the Eastern Coast, but it's like you're never going to find them in Wine Searcher or anything. And Laura, she was so excited to go visit Raffinelli. Like, I'm finally going. I'm going to go check them out. I'm going to meet them at the tasting room. But then I was kind of like, oh, okay, I'm there for like 5 minutes because they pour you their 3 wines and then that's it, you know? but I guess hands-on family kind of appeal to it. So Alexander Valley, Knights Valley, this is again warmer regions further inland. You can find some wonderful Cabernets, kind of cool. I mean, it gets its name from Cyrus Alexander, who would receive this land grant originally from Mexico. From a lot of these guys were part of the Mexican army before it eventually. I might actually got ahead of myself there. A lot of these areas were originally given land grants from the Mexican army, like generals that had given their time. But I'm like, well, this is actually past the time of California actually being recognized as its own state. But anyway, Alexander Valley, where it gets its name from, is Cyrus Alexander, the first to plant grapes in this appellation. Post-phylloxera prohibitions, world wars. Robert Young, he was influential in that he was the first to actually plant Cabernet in Alexander Valley as this region was starting to rebuild itself. But Rodney Strong, he was the first to release a vineyard designated Cabernet Sauvignon from this area. I think pretty recognizable name, Rodney Strong. So first to kind of replant, first to release a single vineyard or vineyard designate. And then even though it's a warm climate, it's not quite, or maybe another way of saying it, Knights Valley is the warmest AVA in all of Sonoma. So although you can get ripe Cabernets here that might get into 14.5 alcohol, they're still a little more herbaceous and earthier and restrained from riper styles that you even see from Knights Valley. They'd say if you really like California cab or Napa cabs that can be lush and ripe and maybe a little more powerful, you probably would enjoy the more common styles in Knights Valley, just because it shares a similar um, climate and similar weather, producing similar styles of fruit. Some of these, like our Italian brother Simi that started this winery in the late 1800s, is overseen by their daughter, who ran it throughout the most of the 1900s until she passed away, and she was around in the winery until like late. Her name was Isabella something, or Isabella Simi. She was with the winery until like the 80s and 90s, even after it sold to a larger group. You had the Francis Ford Coppola winery over here in Alexander, and then you also have Clos de Bois. Again, Russian River over here, but then we're bordering Mayacamas. Besides the warmest appellation, Knights Valley, the guy, it took its name too from a gentleman whose name was Knights in like the late 1800s as well. But one of the more modern producers and one of the few producers that releases wines from Knights Valley is Peter Michael, who Vanessa Wong of Peay had originally worked for. He has a bottling called Le Pivot that usually people are pretty excited about. But being from England, he's an actual Knight, so it's kind of funny that Peter Michael, one of the top producers, is actually a Knight based out of that region. And I just got my 2 wines here. And that's what I think I got. I kept myself a little more on time than what I usually do, and I'm not ashamed of that. Do you guys have do you have any questions? There's a lot of wonderful material I came across with podcasts and everything. If you've been to these, I'll share a bunch of those. A lot of them you can find on Levi Dalton's I'll Drink to That, where you can hear from Joel Peterson, Morgan Tate, Twain Peterson, Rod Berglund of Joseph Swan. It just goes on and on. You can hear from all of these guys, and it's just really fun to hear their process and hear the history unfold under their own words. Their time spent with Andrei Chalachev, all really cool. If anybody, I know it's because a few of you study, if you actually have an account to Guildsom, they have this e-learning. It's really cool. I love going through it. It's a practice of, you go through each AVA. So you're reading little tidbits and then taking little quizzes afterwards, but you're seeing pictures of maps, you're seeing pictures of labels. But it was really fun to go through that, the Guildsom e-learning on Sonoma County. That gave you some of these takeaways, like who was the first to plant there, who's still farming there, what are some of these major vineyards. It's where I saw all those came across all those like subregions of Russian River Valley that I quickly brought up. I never even really heard of that as being much of a conversation before, but I'm sure it'll be something we'll most likely hear more of. And then I'm just kind of scrolling through if there's anything else really that I wanted to kind of get into, because I know there's a lot of it. Yeah, I love it that you brought up like Pax, because he does some wonderful Syrahs. I love it that we're bringing up people like Fela, who also does wonderful Syrahs. Just great stuff. I think of Anthill Farms, another person that they do work with some great Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. The current winemaker for Hirsch is this guy, Anthony Filiberti. He was one of the 3 guys that started Anthill Farms. But anyway, there's a progression of mentorship. If you guys follow wine, you're like, oh, this person's working for them now, and this is where we get to see it. Like Jolie Lade is a really popular one. They got their start working at PAX, all sorts. Rain is Mondavi's grandson, right? Yeah, it's his grandson. That's cool stuff.
That's good. He's making wine over at PAX, I think.
Is he? Wow,
he's making rain over in the same facility.
Yeah, I know that he's sharing that facility with quite a few people. I only discovered Rain when we got a bottle from them from Charlotte, or we had a Charlotte location for a while, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is Robert Mondavi's grandson, which is so cool. another one. I guess I'm only bringing some of those things up because we can see that tie in this relation and progression. But who's the one? Why is it escaping me right now? Arnold Roberts. They do some like Sonoma. So they do some Chardonnays and stuff too. They source from all over the place, but really pretty labels where it was Mondavi's widow it's another relation to the Mondavi family, where it was Mondavi's widow that does the label artwork for their labels, because it was his stepmother or something like that. Anyway, it's Arnold Roberts. And then I'll maybe mention some of these producers in the follow-up with a recording, which we'll send. I should be able to do it tomorrow, so we have other producers check out. And I'm glad that you're bringing these up in chat, because even if we work in wine, there's oftentimes wonderful discoveries, or there's producers that we don't come across all the time.
Yeah, in the chat, someone mentioned flowers. Don't they do biodynamic farming, I think, under a woman winemaker that's there? It's really nice. And their properties are really beautiful too.
They're out in Fort Ross. Flowers.
Way up towards really north, I think.
Yeah,
I forget where they are.
I don't remember what they're doing in the vineyards as far as farming. No, yeah, thank you, Jeff. I know we're a little over. If you have the wines, I hope you like them. We all love that Peay stuff. You're supporting some awesome people. I might share that the recording too of that time we had with Andy Peay, so you could hear from him as well. You can hear from him in a few different areas. Marcusson is also up there in near the Fort Ross area too. I forget who's making those wines though. Flowers. Anyway, you brought up the lady winemaker. I'm like, I know who that was, but it's escaping me. Anyway.
I forget her name.
Yeah, there was a guy that was actually anyway. Well, thank you so much, Rocchioli. Yes, got a great interview with Joe Rocchioli, and I'll drink to that. I mean, just to hear from these guys themselves, like, man, you are just, you definitely feel like you're I'm listening to Creedence Clearwater or something in the middle of the 70s, listening to these guys, you know, like, you're like, oh, you're just, you know,
that's an excellent analogy, actually.
You know, so really, you know, that's the personalities that we should see. You know, I'll let you guys get going. I remember, you know, starting wine, they say, well, Napa's like all the chateaus of Bordeaux, and Sonoma's like Burgundy, where you have all the farmers. I don't think that's necessarily true, but maybe one analogy: you're hanging out more with the farmers, that have more hands on. You're getting your hands dirty and hanging out in the vineyards over here. So
you see a lot of old Chevy pickups.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, all right.
It's true. I kind of like your analogy, actually.
Yeah.
God, yeah, they were talking about like it was Joel Peterson, it was Joseph Swan, and like Andrei Chelichev. Like there's a picture, I think it was those guys like hanging out in the vineyards like in the 1970s, and I forgot who it is. They're wearing their white bell bottom. Like it's just a different time. Like like who are these guys? But there wasn't a lot of people in the area at the time. But all right. Have a good night.
Great class as always.
We'll play
Yeah,
the
thanks,
Creedence.
Ryan.
We'll play Creedence for our next Sonoma class. We'll have it in the background.
That's the deal.
Yeah. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Ambulance is important.
Bye, Kelly. Always nice to see you too. Dayton, new folks.
Thanks.